Welcome to Sacramento, the capital city of California and home to the California State Railroad Museum. In this video, we'll take a tour of this famous railroad museum as it was on August 6, 2017. We'll start our tour here at the museum's main building. Upon entering, visitors enter an indoor recreation of the construction of the first transcontinental main line during the 1860s in the High Sierras, which would later become known as Donner Pass, on the section between Sacramento and Sparks, Nevada. At this part of the museum, Central Pacific, later Southern Pacific, 440 American Type No. 1, the Governor Stanford, is on display. This steam locomotive was built in 1863 by the Norris Locomotive Works in Philadelphia and was assembled in Sacramento. This locomotive was involved in the construction of the first transcontinental main line early in its life on the Central Pacific. Not surprisingly, the Governor Stanford was named after Leland Stanford, who was the first president of the Central Pacific Railroad and a former California governor. The Governor Stanford steam locomotive has several superlatives. It pulled the first passenger train, the first revenue freight train, and the first excursion train for the Central Pacific. After being retired in 1895, the Governor Stanford locomotive was donated in 1899 to Leland Stanford's widow, Jane Lathrop Stanford, who then donated the locomotive to Stanford University in Palo Alto, where it remained until 1963. In May of 1963, it was loaned to the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society's Pacific Coast chapter, which would form the basis for the current California State Railroad Museum's collection. Although it resides in a scene that recreates the 1860s, the locomotive has been restored to its 1899 appearance due to the fact that a complete cosmetic restoration to its 1860s appearance would be impossible without damaging the original locomotive. Just outside of the Transcontinental Main Line construction scene is a small display of the completion of the Transcontinental Main Line when the Golden Spike was driven in Promontory, Utah, connecting the first coast-to-coast American train route. Moving further into the museum, we see two Baldwin-built 440 American-type steam locomotives, coincidentally having the same number, number 12. On the left is Virginia and Truckee number 12, Genoa, which was built in 1873, and on the right is North Pacific Coast number 12, Sonoma, which was built in 1876. The Sonoma is a narrow-gauge steam locomotive, and so are the two passenger cars behind it. The two narrow-gauge passenger cars are the Monterey and Salinas Valley Combine Car number 1 and the Nevada Central Railway Coach number 3. The Sonoma is the sole survivor of all North Pacific Coast locomotives. Both the Genoa and the Sonoma have been dressed up as the Central Pacific Jupiter in reenactments of the Golden Spike celebration at exhibitions across the United States in the 20th century. The Genoa was dressed up as Jupiter for the 1939 New York World's Fair and the 1948 Chicago Railroad Fair, while the Sonoma was dressed up as Jupiter for the 1939 Golden Gate International Exposition on San Francisco's Treasure Island. Next is the Central Pacific, later Southern Pacific, 424 tank engine, C.P. Huntington, built by Danforth Cook & Company in Paterson, New Jersey in 1863 and assembled in California in 1864. This small steam locomotive was another locomotive that was involved in the construction of the first transcontinental railroad route. It was number 3 on the Central Pacific and then transferred to the Southern Pacific, where it was renumbered to number 1. When it was in active service on the Southern Pacific, it pulled local and commuter passenger trains from San Francisco to Hollister, California. The C.P. Huntington was officially retired in 1900, but the Southern Pacific used it for years after its retirement at exhibitions across the United States, like the 1939 New York World's Fair, and also the opening of Union Station in Los Angeles in 1939. Up next is the Virginia and Truckee 260 Mogul Type, number 13 Empire. This steam locomotive was built by Baldwin in 1873 for freight service primarily. It was retired from the Virginia and Truckee in 1918 and then sold to the Pacific Portland Cement Company in Gerlach, Nevada in 1924, where it was used as a switcher until 1931. The Empire received an extensive cosmetic restoration in the 1970s and now sits around mirrors so visitors can see the locomotive from all angles to better understand the craftsmanship that went into the building of steam locomotives from the late 19th century. Across from the Empire is Southern Pacific 4882 AC-12 class cab forward number 4294. This locomotive was built by Baldwin in 1944 and was the last steam locomotive built for the Southern Pacific. In addition, it is the sole survivor of all Southern Pacific cab forwards. The cab forwards were mixed traffic locomotives, meaning they could pull passenger trains and freight trains, but they were used mostly to pull freight trains due to their size and power. They were used on many of Southern Pacific's routes in California and Nevada, and the reason why the Southern Pacific ordered cab-forward type steam locomotives is because steam locomotive crews on Donner Pass would choke to death when going through long tunnels in ordinary smokebox-forward steam locomotives. By having the cab be at the front of the locomotive, the smoke would always be behind the crew when going forward through a tunnel.
So,
4294's cab is open to the public and usually has a volunteer tour guide in it. Let's hear what he has to say. In the meantime, the control and gauge names have been listed in subtitles.
Yeah, so they would seal it in the steam and then they would pressurize and inject it in the firebox. So I'm just throwing out the fuel injection thing, right?
That's great. No, I love it. It's you're exactly right.
So here's something else that's interesting. This was the last steam locomotive SP purchased in 1944. 1944, World War II was going on. 65% of the manufacturing was done by women. This could have been built by
absolutely.
just one engine.
Why not?
Okay.
Yeah, and it was mostly used for long haul freight.
They were built to go from Sac Marine up over the mountain.
That's would need the horsepower.
Well, the snow sheds.
Yeah.
It's the cab forward.
Yeah.
There's a friend of mine was telling me he's read a lot of old books on railroading, and he was telling me that he's read a couple old stories of an engineer and fireman actually becoming asphyxiated in a conventional locomotive, going up over the Sierra Nevadas and waking up going down the inside.
Because they're in the smoke coming out.
Yeah,
Exactly.
And then about 1905, there was an engineer that stopped his freight train in Colfax, turned the engine around and towed it up backwards, and then it caught on. Okay.
Oh, he did it on purpose.
Yeah. So then by 1910, they first cab forward came out. Okay.
They figured it out.
And they say at first they were kind of leery about operating these because the fireman and the engineer, if they hit something, there's no protection up here.
Yeah.
But then as it turned out, no cab forwards hit anything in the visibility.
Excellent, because they can see far enough away.
Yeah, they can see really well. And and you would think it would be really warm in here, but it's this big huge firebox, right? But there's heaters on both sides.
Oh, yeah.
On the floor. So I'm thinking you could open the windows and the hatch and get a pretty good draft through here. Probably, 7 months out of the year they're driving through snow.
Do you happen to know what pressure the boiler operated at?
I don't.
Okay.
I would imagine probably 200 pounds, maybe a little bit more.
Okay.
Because now this was the furthest advanced that they were at steam.
High tech. Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is a delightful day. Thank you.
Good. You have a good day. Okay.
You bet. We just joined.
Okay. So now you're being a foundation member, you get into Railtown up in Jamestown too.
Oh, okay.
Did they tell you that?
No, it says it here.
Okay.
I'll look it up.
So you can ride the Sac Southern.
Okay.
Now that you're a member, and you don't have to pay for the tickets, and you can ride the steam train at Railtown in Jamestown.
Fantastic.
Because we are connected with that. See? So, thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks for coming. So, do you want to know why they made cab forwards?
No.
You don't want to know?
I mean, I do want to know. I don't know why. Oh, can you just sit there?
So, back in the day,
As we move on into the future, which features a prototype of a California high-speed train built by Siemens. The plan is to have high-speed rail service from San Francisco to Los Angeles and Anaheim in 2029 in its first phase. If these high-speed trains run at 220 miles an hour for most of the run non-stop, the travel time from San Francisco to Los Angeles would be less than 3 hours. This prototype is based on the Siemens Deutsche Bahn ICE 3 high-speed electric train sets in Europe, and both the passenger compartment and the cab are enterable to the public at the museum.
But these are high speed to get there fast.
Here in the cab, we'll take a closer look at the controls and gauges. Subtitles have been added to the controls and gauges that are not clearly labeled.
Okay, you have to wait your turn.
You guys gonna each sit in the chair? Do you want Sissy to drive and you can be her co-pilot? Okay. You can help her push the buttons, you think?
Can you really push the button?
Now that we've seen the future, we return to the past. To the right of the engineer's side of the high-speed train prototype is Southern Pacific P8 Class 462 Pacific Type steam locomotive number 2467. This locomotive was built by Baldwin in 1921 for passenger service primarily. It's currently on loan to the museum by the Pacific Locomotive Association and the City of Oakland.
They lean out the side.
While the cab is not enterable to the public, a stairway has been put next to it so the public can look into the cab from the fireman's side. Next to the fireman's side of the high-speed train prototype is a bus. Union Pacific Bus number 27 was built by GMC in 1949 and was used in the greater Los Angeles area to shuttle passengers around who got off of or were going onto Union Pacific passenger trains. Back to the trains, we see Southern Pacific F7A unit number 6402, which was built in 1952 by General Motors Electromotive Division. This diesel locomotive is currently stripped of its jacketing, which allows viewers to see the inner workings of a diesel-electric locomotive. Next is the Santa Fe dining car number 1474, Cachiti. This streamlined dining car was built in 1936 by the Budd Company and was used in the Santa Fe's premier passenger train, the Super Chief, which ran between Los Angeles and Chicago. The dining room and the corridor around the kitchen are accessible to the public, but the kitchen is only viewable. In the dining room, the tables have been set with dish and silverware sets from railroads across the United States. There's usually a volunteer tour guide in the dining room section.
But I'm pretty sure they memorize it. And then we order the food and then they go
When they reopened, they find a way to walk the child this was a technology decision made when they built the car in 1970. The choice was a brand that they
Not all of the equipment at the California State Railroad Museum ran on American-based railroads. The Canadian National Sleeping Car, St. Hyacinth, is also part of the museum's collection. This heavyweight sleeping car was built by Canadian Car and Foundry in 1929 and was retired by the Canadian National in 1971. This car has an enterable interior and also has a mechanism that makes it rock and roll as if it's moving. To add more realism, train sounds like steam locomotive whistles, clickety-clack, and trackside railroad crossings play throughout the car.
Ooh, I feel the train moving. Do you feel it?
Wow.
So, yeah. But George Pullman designed the same kind of car across America.
Produce has always been an important industry in California, and the California State Railroad Museum has their own display representing this industry with 1920s built Fruit Growers Express wood-sided 40-foot reefer car, number 35832, and a freight station.
Sweet potatoes, sweet potatoes.
Wasn't it
Another passenger car from a railroad that didn't serve California is Georgia Northern number 100, the Gold Coast, a heavyweight observation car built by the Central of Georgia in 1905. On the upper level of the museum is a model train exhibit. This is the pre-war era section of it, showcasing model trains from roughly 1900 to 1944, mostly Lionel trains.
Wait till we get over there. Is there a seat? Go blow the whistle. Push the button. Corner.
This part of the museum also has a great viewpoint to see the lower level of the museum.
They don't do anything for me.
The museum's model train exhibit also has a pre-war Lionel layout with standard gauge and O-gauge trains from the pre-war era that are running.
So they're going. Somebody needs to start jumping.
This is a different video. It's from a different take. So I will give you your ticket. You can be in ours.
Oh, yeah. Mom, you're correct. This is a way different.
Next to the layout is the post-war era section, showcasing model trains from roughly 1945 to 1969, with mostly Lionel trains. At the end of the model train exhibit is the modern and digital era section, showcasing model trains from roughly 1970 to present day, with mostly Lionel trains, but other manufacturers' trains are seen too, like Bachmann and LGB. On the balcony above the museum, a narrow gauge train is on display. The locomotive is Nevada Short Line Mogul type steam locomotive number 1, which was built by Baldwin in 1879. Coupled to this locomotive are 3 narrow gauge freight cars, which include Southern Pacific wood-sided boxcar number 331, Southern Pacific tank car number 145, and Pacific Coast Caboose number 2. This now concludes our tour of the museum's main building, and we will take a look at the Central Pacific Railroad passenger station just outside the museum's main building. This is a recreation of the original Sacramento Central Pacific Railroad passenger station and has been made to look the way the original station looked in the late 19th century. The California State Railroad Museum uses the tracks in here for storage of their operational equipment and keeps other locomotives and cars in their collection on display for the public to see. Let's take a closer look at some of them. California State Railroad Museum number 2 is a GE 25-tonner diesel switcher, also known as a Little Critter, and was built in 1952 to run at the American Creosote Works plant in Winfield, Louisiana. It is now used at the museum's grounds for switching purposes. Here is some footage of it in action at the end of the day, bringing the Sacramento Southern observation car into the Central Pacific Railroad passenger station for the night.
We're gonna go grab the Eldorado and shove it in the barn. I'm even thinking about.
Back inside the Central Pacific Railroad station, we see the Virginia and Truckee 240 steam locomotive J.W. Boker. This locomotive was built in 1875 by Baldwin to be used as a switcher for the Virginia and Truckee and was sold to the Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber Company in 1896. It was featured in the Cecil B. DeMille movie Union Pacific from 1939. It is now the sole survivor of all 240 steam locomotives in the United States. Attached to the J.W. Boker are two wood-sided passenger cars, a combine and a coach.
A journey across the Sierra Nevada in deep winter was bone-chilling. A coal stove at each end of the cart eased the intense cold. Although today the trip would seem quite slow to Americans, the comparative ease and speed of travel in a wood coach like this was an absolute marvel in 1876. The station platform and waiting room are crowded with people and baggage. Imagine everything first in the loosey
At the south end of the station, Union Pacific 060 tender engine number 4466 was on display. This steam locomotive was built by the Lima Locomotive Works in 1920 and spent most of its life as a switcher in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was also operational at the museum until 2001. So this concludes our tour of the California State Railroad Museum as it was on August 6, 2017. If you like trains, then the California State Railroad Museum is for you. No matter if you live in California or if you are just visiting there, it's a world-class railroad museum that is worth every penny and has an amazing collection of railroad equipment. Thanks for watching!